So I want to really bless you with a message today, and the title of the message is 4 Reasons to Stay at Home. 4 reasons to stay at home. How many of you, and I want you to raise your hand if this is true for you, how many of you have ever woken up in the morning to the sound of your alarm and wanted to throw that alarm across the room and pretend like the rest of the day doesn't have to happen? If your hand isn't raised, do you struggle with lying? How many of you have ever got home like the middle of the afternoon, never mind late at night, the middle of the afternoon, like 3 o'clock, and you decided that's it for the day, and you close the curtains and you were like, I'm done. Right? I realize I'm so bad at this, okay? I do this so often. I just get home and it doesn't matter what time it is. I just close the curtains. I'm like, enough world. I've had enough of you and your stuff. So I close the curtains, and I didn't realize I had made such a habit of it. The other day, I came home with the kids, and Ethan and Charlotte walked into the room, and it was about 3 o'clock, and they just started closing curtains. And I was like, guys, what are you doing? No, the day's over. We're done. We've had enough. We're finished. And I was like, maybe I need to change my habits because it's rubbing off on my children a little bit too much. But how many of you ever felt like that? If I can just close out the world for a bit, enough is enough, I'm done, it's over, and I just want to be on my own. Ever felt like that? How many of you remember, a little while ago, that first family meeting we had with President Cyril? And he said, you have to stay home. Remember that? You are not allowed to leave. I'm not going to lie to you. Even though I'm a pastor, I was like, Jesus, I've been training for this my whole life. The introvert inside of me jumped up and started doing a jig. My introverted self was like, I can do this. Pick me, Jesus. I think the most useless thing during lockdown was your alarm clock. Right? But it was amazing. As excited as I was, it was amazing how quickly the negative side effects of isolation set in. It was amazing how quickly, when we were told to shut the world out, how much we suffered. Mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, we suffered. When we were told, when it was law to shut the world out, we suffered. Because you and I were not meant to live disconnected. We were meant for community. We were meant to do life with one another. And yet there are still some times when our emotions go, I can't handle you. I'm not talking about you. Life. People. Have you ever been peopled out? Anyway, moving on. Ever been in a room full of people, and never mind just staying at home, it's amazing how we can feel isolated in community. You don't have to be in a lockdown to feel alone. You can be in a room like this, full of people, and still feel fundamentally alone. And all the things that our world tells you that you're connected, you can have an inbox full of emails. You can have a calendar full of invites. You can have Facebook full of likes, friends, followers, whatever the case is. You can have all those things and you can still feel alone. Loneliness is not about how many people you have around you, it's about how many people you're connected to. And so it's amazing how we can feel like that. We can feel in the midst of a crowd or at home, we can feel forgotten, overlooked, left out. And some of us know what that feels like. To feel like everyone else has got it going on except me. Everyone I look on Instagram, man, they are living the life. And then there's me. And so we know what it feels like to be alone. We know what it feels like to be isolated. And yet what I want to show you today is that there are 4 biblical reasons for you to stay home. If you're new to the church, you're wondering, this might be the worst sermon I've ever heard. This is the first time I've come to church and now you're telling me I mustn't come. Don't worry. Don't worry. The passage we're going to look at is a pretty obscure passage. It's in the book of Leviticus. I know. It's amazing. You say the word Leviticus and the whole room goes, oh. But don't worry. So the passage we're going to be diving into, the chapter we're unlocking, is all about leprosy. Okay? Now, Again, Leviticus and leprosy. Could it get any worse? Anyway, the passage we're going to look at, the context is Moses is talking to the people, and he's giving them, at the beginning of the chapter, he gives an overarching process. He says, if you have leprosy, you do X, Y, and Z. Okay? So he gives an overarching process at the beginning. Then for the rest of the chapter, he begins to speak about specific situations that might lead to leprosy that you've got to be very aware of. And he gives 4 reasons why you would need to go to the priest, and the priest would tell you to go home. Okay? 4 scenarios, 4 examples, 4 reasons that the priest would look at it and say, you need to go home. Are you ready for this? Some of you have been waiting your whole life for this. You're going to go to your boss tomorrow morning and go, I've been told. Number 1, in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 18, we read about boils. I told you, this is not, you're going to go home and go, did I really hear a whole message about skin disease? Yes. Okay. Now, again, just like leprosy was an overarching term used for all skin diseases, right? When we think about leprosy, we think about a very specific nerve disease. But in Leviticus, when they used the word leprosy, it was an overarching term for all skin disease. Okay? So if you had eczema, you were leprous. Right? How hectic is that? If you had bad acne, it could be interpreted as leprosy. That's how hectic this was. Obviously, extreme cases. So, just as much as leprosy was a broad topic, boils, we can't understand boils in the same way they are today. A boil, I looked this up because I know there are doctors in the room. And you never want someone to walk away going, he was talking rubbish. Okay, we have medical professionals in the room. So I did my research. Okay, a boil in today's, if you talk about a boil today, often it's an infection of a hair follicle. Okay, anyway. But what a boil, when they talk about a boil in Leviticus, they're not talking about an infected hair follicle. What they're talking about was closer to an ulcer. Okay, an ulcer of the skin. Now, again, I did my research on this, and what can cause an ulcer on the skin? Well, if you've ever had to deal with a bed sore or know someone who's dealt with a bed sore, that's an ulcer that kind of appears because of lack of movement. So if there's no movement, Shanae's looking at me very critically right now. She's like, you better get this right. The other thing that can cause an ulcer on your skin is if there's a lack of blood flow to that area of your body. Okay? And if there's no blood flow, your skin begins to break and you can get an ulcer. Okay? Yeah, cool. Now, here's the thing, right? Essentially, what that's saying is when there's a disconnection between the outside and the inside, okay? When your body is not providing what it needs to, when things are out of order, when you're not moving like you should, when your body is not connected like it should, when things are out of order, you can develop an ulcer, and that ulcer can lead to leprosy, and that can lead you to isolation. You following? Okay, so when things are out of order, it can go down the track and it'll lead you to isolation. When things are out of order in the inside of us, often what that looks like is rebellion. When you come out of the authority of God, when the things that are supposed to support you aren't supporting you anymore, it's rebellion. And this can happen in 2 scenarios. Sometimes the rebellion is against you. Okay? It's amazing how we live in a world where we've come to depend on things that are now no longer dependable. Right? Amy Orr Ewing talks about the fact that we live in a world that has chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety. Not just individuals, we live in society that struggles with chronic anxiety. And the reason she says that we struggle with this is because the things we have learned to depend on are no longer dependable. You know that feeling. You plan your whole day. You looked at the load shedding schedule in the morning. How many of you, that's the first thing you look on your phone when you wake up? Right? And so what you do is you plan your day. You know when you're going to go out, when you're going to come in, which route you're going to take. So you plan your whole day. And then at 10 o'clock or whatever, they say, we're escalating the schedule. For what? And now your whole plan is thrown out. You get home, you put on the light switch, and there's nothing because they changed the schedule. The very thing we've even come to depend on an app to tell us what's broken. And when the things we depend on are no longer dependable, we feel like the world is against us. If I turn on my tap and no water comes out. There's a lot of, am I hitting a sore note here, right? When the government we were supposed to trust is no longer integrous, but operates with corruption. When the police force, we need to pay for extra security because we don't trust the police. It's amazing, right? And all of this, and it's so easy when we feel like everything's going against us, when we can't trust anything, because we feel like everything's rebelling against us. What do? We try escalate our control in a small space. If I can't trust Eskom, what do? I buy solar panels. If I can't trust Joburg Water, what do? I buy a borehole. And so what happens is, this is important, what we try to do is, all of a sudden now, we try make, if I'm being rebelled against in wide society, then what I try to do is I try to create a very small area that I have absolute control over. You want to make me feel uncertain? You want to make me feel vulnerable? I can't trust you anymore? That's fine. I'm just going to trust in myself, and I want to make a very small area very controlled. But then the problem with that is you never want to leave your controlled space. I don't want to go to church because I can't control that. I don't want to go to life group because I can't control. And so what happens is we end up, because of the rebellion against us, we end up in a very small, isolated space. The other kind of rebellion is when we rebel. And I'm weary of this, right? Because there are leaders, pastors, preachers, who have manipulated people and have hurt people. And if that's you here this morning and you've got the courage to come back into church, I applaud you, because I know how sore and how hurtful that can be. And so I applaud you for coming back into community. But there are some times when we just take offense, and because we've taken offense, we remove ourselves from community. The preacher stands up on the platform and preaches something, and you take offense at it. There are people in this world who I know are offended at me. And my goal is not to make you offended. Okay? I don't wake up on Sunday mornings going, time to offend some people. Right? That's not my heart as a pastor, but I know that the gospel is offensive. It's not going to let you be you. The tagline of the gospel is, you be you. No. And so it's offensive, but it's easy to be offended with the messenger. And so what happens is sometimes we can be so offended with the messenger that we come out of community because of rebellion. Are we okay? So number one, Boyle speaks to rebellion. Rebellion can help us or cause us to stay home. Number two is burns. Leviticus 13:24 talks about if you've been burnt on the skin and it becomes raw flesh, you have to go to the high priest. Okay? I'm on a lot more steady ground here because a burn is a burn. And this is profound because a burn is not a disease. Okay? If you've ever been burnt, you know this. Like, you didn't want to get burned. It happened to you. But what a burn does is it creates an area of vulnerability, of weakness, and sensitivity. And if a boil represents rebellion, then a burn represents trauma. If you and I can go through trauma, what happens is it makes us sensitive, makes us feel vulnerable, and it makes us feel weak. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I would guarantee if I asked people in this room to raise your hand if you've gone through something traumatic, every hand would go up. I guarantee that if I were to ask everyone in this room, do you know someone who's gone through something traumatic just in the past month? Many of us would raise our hand. Why? Because we've become comfortable with trauma. We live in a nation that is traumatic. And as much as I love this country, I love South Africa. Watch me watch a sports game and you'll see how much I love this country. And I love South Africa, but it is not okay that we've become okay with trauma. And you can tell we've become okay with trauma because when we hear a traumatic story, our initial response is, it could be worse. It's not that bad. And we have other stories that we think trumps that story. Instead of being impacted by the trauma, we're like, that's not that bad. They did a study of South Africa, and they came to the conclusion, it was a psychological study, and they came to the conclusion that as a nation, if you were to diagnose the nation, we suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We become so traumatized that we don't even know we're traumatized. And the reason I say all of this is because trauma, when we go through trauma, when we go through something traumatic, either violent or whatever the case is, when we go through trauma and it creates that area of weakness, that area of sensitivity, one of the hardest things is to come back into community. Even if it's loving community, because it's raw. I recently, many of you know, I had a hernia operation. Good fun, I recommend it. But it was amazing how, even at conference weekend, I was standing in the front there so aware of my injury because it was still raw, that I was kind of having my hands like this because it was a bit of a mosh pit in the weekend. And I was like, young people, stay away. Back up. Right? Why? Because you've got an area of sensitivity, you've got an area of weakness, an area of vulnerability. And it's the same with a burn, it's the same with trauma. When you come back into community with trauma, you try to keep everyone's at arm's distance because you don't want them to touch the nerve. And people will come to you out of love and genuine affection, and they'll say this, how are you doing? And it is the last question you want to answer. I don't know how I'm doing. How am I supposed to tell you how I'm doing? And it's hard, and it's tough, and it's awkward, and you don't want to answer the same question 17 times. And if all of us have gone through trauma, and if it's awkward for all of us, then it's hard because all of us then have a reason to stay home. It's easier to stay home. Because I don't want people to see me as vulnerable. I don't want people to experience me in my weakest. And so instead of coming to loving community, even though it's going to be a bit awkward, what happens is we stay home. Right? Some of you are going, why did I get up this morning for this? Number 1, boil. Number 2, burn. Yeah, some of you are going, I should have stayed at home today. Number 3 is disease. And this is the logical one, right? When we're talking about leprosy, disease, Leviticus 13:29 talks about a disease specifically on the head. But it's pretty obvious. Obviously, this is the one you're trying to control, the one they're trying to keep from spreading. But what is a disease? A disease is when something external attacks you. There are other forms, but the majority of diseases, flu, cold, all that kind of stuff, is when you get a virus or a bacteria inside of you and it begins to attack you. And so if the first one talks about rebellion, if the second one talks about trauma, the third one talks about attack. And some of the people in this room, we know what it feels like to be under attack. Right? You may be going through a situation right now where you know there's a spiritual element behind it, and you're under attack. You might have been going through the same thing week after week. I love how Pastor DJ says it. Sometimes it's just normal, but sometimes you know that there's more to the cycle than the cycle. And you know there's an attack. Sometimes even though you've performed better than everyone else, you get overlooked for a promotion. Sometimes you know that, hey, you've gone to interview after interview and you are the right candidate, but you never get the job. Sometimes you're fighting about the same thing with your spouse over and over, and you just can't seem to move past it. Whatever the attack is, we know what it feels like to be attacked. And here's the scary thing about when we get attacked. Our default is to look for what we did wrong. When we're under attack, we, like Job's friends, read the book of Job, it's amazing. Job loses everything. He loses his children, his possessions, his property. He loses everything. And his friends, what do? What did you do, Job? Why? Because when we go through something bad, we want to find out why so that we never go through it again. If I can unpack the cause of this effect, I can avoid it in future. And if we buy into the lie that the attack is my fault, I'm to blame. It was because I didn't come to church that one weekend. It was because I didn't pray 7 days last week. It was because I swore at that driver. I used the universal sign of discontent that constitutes a single finger. And so what we do is we rack our history trying to find out, what did I do wrong that means that I'm vulnerable to attack now? And what does that line of thinking do? It'll only ever bring shame. If I'm to blame for the attack I'm going through, then I'm shameful, and how can I come to church when I'm racked with shame? How can I come to community when I'm shameful? And the attack might not necessarily have to destroy you, it can just keep you isolated. The attack doesn't have to wreck you, it can just rob you of community. Because it's very hard to step into community when you feel like everyone knows how bad you are. If I can see how bad I am, obviously everyone knows how bad I am. And so an attack of the enemy, what it can do is it can cause you to believe the lie that you are to blame for the attack. And if that's true, then the entire Gospels are wrong. Jesus was obedient to the Father, and he got attacked more than anyone else. Job, the reason he got attacked is because he loved Jesus, or loved God, and God loved him. Number 4, and this is my most exciting point I think I've ever preached in my life. Point number 4 is baldness. We have to rediscover a theology of baldness. Just putting that out there. Some of you with hair are laughing at me. God forgive them. I want to read this because this is important. This is important truth. Leviticus 13, verse 40. No, this is not on the screen. I want you to hear this. Get this. If a man's hair falls out from his head, he is bald. But the next 3 words are the most important words you will hear. If a man's hair falls out from his head, he is bald, he is clean. Don't tell me Leviticus isn't relevant. Come on now. Then it keeps going, verse 41. And if a man's hair falls out from his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead. He is clean. I had a friend who used to say, if you go bald from the front, it's because you're a thinker. If you go bald from the back, you're sexy. I'm going bald from the front and the back, which means I just think I'm sexy. But I love the way Moses is so blunt. It feels like he's having to address the situation here. It feels like up until this point, people had been walking past bald people going, unclean, unclean. And Moses comes and goes, no, they're not. Thank you, Pastor Ronald. But then he goes on in verse 42 and he says, but if there is on the bald head or the bald forehead a reddish, whitish, diseased area that's causing the loss of hair, he's leprous. And it makes me laugh because I've just got to keep my head clean. So, in other words, what is Moses saying here? He's saying there's some baldness that's natural, but there is a kind of baldness, there's a kind of loss that's unnatural. There is unnatural loss. If our first point was rebellion, our second point was trauma, our third point was attack, our fourth point is when we go through unnatural loss, it convinces us to just stay home. And what do I mean by unnatural loss? Listen, all of us have to navigate loss in life. None of us are going to get through life without grief. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but all of us have to grieve something. But there are those moments where we lose something that God never intended for us to lose. Where we lose something that is unnatural. We lose something that we were never meant to be separated from. And in that moment, it can break us and it can drive us out of community into isolation. What do I mean? When a marriage fails because the spouse is unfaithful. that loss is not God's intention for you. When a career ends because of other people's corruption. When your reputation is tainted because people are lying about you. When a child loses their innocence through abuse. When two parents have a miscarriage. When we lose the ability to process emotions in a healthy way because we're so anxious or depressed. When we grow older, and perhaps you know someone you love and they've lost the ability to think straight through dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever the case is. These are just a few examples of unnatural loss. And when you experience unnatural loss, the grief is unlike anything. It hurts. You feel less than. You feel like you're coming back into community as less than a person. Less than who you were before. If it's a loss you were never expecting to experience, you don't have a vocabulary to tell people how you're feeling. And so again, when you come in, a community will rightly be sympathetic towards you and they'll come alongside you and say, how are you? How are you? Oh, I understand. I've gone through something similar. And our response often is, how can you understand? I don't even understand. I can't express my loss. How can you tell me you understand it? And so we end up getting angry with people and with God. And that anger, just as fear and shame in the others kept us away, anger can keep us away here. And what happens is we go alone so we can be angry. Because loss like this is not natural and it drives us from the best thing for us, which is community. And the scary thing about these four things is that in the Old Testament, in the law, it says if you experience boils, if you experience burns, if you experience disease, if you experience unnatural baldness, there will be a man who looks at you, sees your brokenness, sees your suffering, and tells you to go home. Can you imagine hearing those words? Go home. You are not allowed to come into this room. You are not allowed to be with people. You are not allowed to talk to anyone, to get close to anyone. Go home. The high priest. And this is the foundation of everything I've just said, right? The foundation of everything I've just said is that there was a man who had authority. There was a priest who had authority from God to isolate people. And his voice was louder than every other voice. In fact, even a king couldn't gainsay what a high priest said. The king had to submit to whatever the high priest said. We have stories in the Old Testament of kings being isolated because of disease. The high priest spoke those words, and all of a sudden, isolation was your reality. And it's amazing how these things, rebellion, trauma, attack, loss, that these things still speak over us. They still say to us, go home. You're sitting here right now and you might have gone through this, but I guarantee all of us in this room know someone who's at home right now because of one of these four things. Everyone in this room, I guarantee it. If you were to think hard enough, you could pick out a few names of people who are home right now because of one of these. There might be some of you watching online right now, and you know you're at home right now because of this. And you've allowed the voice of rebellion, the voice of attack, the voice of loss, the voice of trauma to echo what the Old Testament high priest would have said over you. But Jesus. See, if Jesus was just king, we would still be stuck under an Old Testament high priest system. But he's not just our high king. He's our high priest. And I want to read to you what the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 10, verse 19 to 25. And again, it's not going to come up on the screens because I want this to settle on you and in you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. When Jesus was stabbed in the side on the cross, that blood and water flowed mingled down. And it purifies our souls and our bodies. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. And here, verse 25, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. You see, if you're still living under the Old Testament, you have 4 reasons to stay home. And there are many more besides that. But if all I have is the Old Testament, there are plenty of reasons, biblical reasons for us to stay home. But then Jesus comes, and he walks the dusty streets of Galilee. And he doesn't wait for the unclean to come to him. He goes and he meets the lepers, and he lays hands on them. And he goes to the woman caught in adultery who's been ostracized, and he says, I don't condemn you. And he goes to the Samaritan lady at the well, and he goes to the tax collectors and the prostitutes, and he goes to the sick and the lame, and he goes to all those who couldn't get to him. And as high priest, he speaks a better word over each and every single one of them. Instead of hearing the voice of the Old Testament priest declaring over you, unclean, go home, we have the voice of Jesus, the great high priest, who says, come home. Come home. Come home. Your destiny is not isolation. Don't keep yourself away. Don't hold out because you're wanting to control it all. Don't keep yourself isolated because you're cross with God or because you're afraid or you're shameful. Come back. Because as much as the Old Testament priest may have said you're unclean, we have a great high priest who looks at you directly where you are. And before you're cleaned up, before you're fixed, before you've done the process, before he declares you are clean. At conference last week, I was standing in the front there, holding back the tears because I loved looking back and watching a church full of people that I know are going through all kinds of hell raise their hands and worship God and declare his praises and his glory. Why? Because I know that this is a church where you do not have to have it all together before you come home. You don't have to have fixed yourself before you can praise the one who loves you. And you see, if you're sitting in your seat here today and you've gone through those 4 things, you've gone through trauma and loss and attack and rebellion, and you've gone through it and you've come out the other side. You know what's easy is to come and bring a scar. But what's difficult is to come bring a raw wound. If you're in the midst of it, if you're in the midst of rebellion, if you're in the midst of an attack, if you're in the midst of trauma, if you're in the midst of unnatural loss, the hardest thing, and we heard this last week, we do not bring to God sacrifices that are already dead. We bring living sacrifices. The kind of worship God wants is not sanitized and perfect. No, he wants real and raw. And it's difficult to stand in a place like this and go, God, it's still raw. It's still vulnerable. It's still sensitive. But because you're my priest, I'm going to bring my raw, my vulnerable, my weak, my painful, and I'm laying it on the altar. Because my high priest doesn't look at me and see what's unclean. He looks and he sees the beauty of my wholeness. I don't know what you've lost. I know some of the stories in this room. I know some of the lives lived in this room. I know some of your tests and some of your testimonies. But as your pastor, can I encourage you today? We're going to sing a song we haven't sung in a long time, Reckless Love. And the bridge of that song is, there's no wall he won't kick down. There's no shadow he won't light up. There's no mountain he won't rip apart to get to you. Because sometimes we don't have enough strength to get to him. in our brokenness and our weakness and our vulnerability and our rawness, sometimes we don't have enough strength even to come to an altar. And so what does he do? He leaves the glory of heaven and he comes to you. But I want to create a moment right now as our worship team leads us in reckless love and they begin to sing these incredible words over us and with us. I want to encourage you, if you're in that place where it's raw and it's hurting and it's real and no one in this room might know how you feel, that's okay. I want to encourage you, right now the altar is open. And when I ask us all to stand in a few moments, if you're saying today's the day I need to bring this raw, painful part of me and lay it at the foot of Jesus, I do no longer want to be defined by my trauma. I do no longer want to be fearful or shameful or angry or any of these things. I want to lay it at the foot of my high priest and I want to see him speak a better word over me. And if that's you, I want to encourage you, come to the altar. And this is, we're not going to come alongside you right now and ask you how you're doing. But what we will do is we'll worship with you. We'll praise with you. Because that's sometimes the best thing a family can do together is praise with people going through storms. And so the worship team are going to start. I'm going to ask us, let's all stand to our feet.